The Temple of Apollo at Didyma once stood as the fourth largest structure in the Greek world, built to rival the Temple of Artemis. The oldest sanctuary of Apollo at Didyma was built in the 8th century BC, likely consisting of a courtyard, altar, laurel tree, and spring. This natural spring was believed to be the source of the oracle's power. Legend has it that after the second temple of Apollo was destroyed, this spring ceased to flow and did not begin again until Alexander the Great reconsecrated the ground in 331 BC. It was not until 30 years after Alexander's conquest, with the return of the cult statue of Apollo in 301 BC, that citizens began rebuilding the older archaic temple that had been plundered and burnt down in 494 BC. This would be the third and final Hellenistic temple of Apollo at Didyma that we can see today. Although construction took place over a period of 600 years, the Temple of Apollo was never actually finished. The main body was completed in 100 BC, and Miletus continued placing the colonnade during the following centuries. The eastern facade was completed during the rule of Hadrian, and the temple never gained its pediments. This drawn-out process and incompleteness makes this building so unique for Greek architecture. It essentially gives us a manual for the different stages of temple construction. In 1979, barely visible etchings were discovered on the high interior walls of the Adyton. These fine lines were the working blueprint of the temple, scratched into the temple walls to serve as a guide over the many years it would take to finish construction. Every Greek temple undergoes years of refinement, resulting in individual, distinctive buildings. After they are complete, however, there is no use for the construction plans. It is fortunate that this construction was never completed, as if the walls had been polished like they should have been, these etchings would have been lost, and we may never have had the insight into the temple planning and construction of this unique building. The exterior of the temple mirrored ordinary Greek temples. However, the interior was unique. The inner chamber, or Adyton, was built on ground level around a sacred spring, rather than on top of a platform or podium. The Temple of Apollo originally had 122 Ionic columns surrounding the temple. They were 60 feet tall, with a diameter of 6 feet at the base. Above the columns sat the architraves with frieze. This frieze was added in Roman chimes and features the head of Medusa. The Crepidoma, the structure on which the temple is built, is of 7 steps that measure about 60 by 120 meters. The stylobate, the top step of the Crepidoma, is 51 by 109 meters. The entrance sits at the east side. Visitors pass through an array of 12 columns in the temple's pronaos to an antechamber with a large window at the top, where one could glimpse the naiscos. 2 passageways sit on either side of this wall. They disappear, not into the cella, but the inner court of the sanctuary. This inner chamber of the temple was open to the sky, allowing a grove of sacred trees to be cultivated. Among the trees stood a much smaller temple, or naiscos, holding this cult statue of Apollo in sacred spring. The temple served as a site for important religious festivals, sacrifices, and votive offerings. The complicated design of the temple at the east end, as well as the provision of a chrismographion, was intended to distance the inquirer of the oracle from the one prophesizing. You could not approach the Adyton directly. The oracle would fast for 3 days in preparation and draw inspiration from the powers of the sacred spring. The prophet would then receive the oracle. The function of the large opening to the pronaos is widely believed to be the place where prophets would speak the response of Apollo to those below. This feature is not seen in any other oracular site. In 70 BC, pirates sacked the temple and construction work was terminated. The sanctuary continued to function. In 100 AD, a new paved road was commissioned by Trajan to the sanctuary from Miletus. By the 3rd century AD, Christianity becomes well established. and the temple gradually falls into disuse. In 262 AD, the temple becomes a fortress against invading Goths and Saracens, thus preventing its destruction. The oracle at Didyma sanctioned statutes, treaties, enterprises, and gave direction on religious and public affairs for the Milesian state and its citizens. The oracle held prestige throughout the Hellenic and Roman Asia and Aegean islands. Monarchs and emperors sought counsel at Didyma. Almost every Western emperor from Caesar to Julian consulted the oracle, the most famous being Diocletian around the year 303 AD. He sent a delegation to Didyma to ask for guidance on the growing number of Christians within the empire, and the widespread concern that the Christians were upsetting the gods. The oracle's response, though long since lost to history, reportedly spurred Diocletian to launch the most severe and systematic prosecution of Christians in Roman history. This temple's role in the prosecution of Christians was not forgotten. While most pagan temples were abandoned and left to decay, in 385 AD, Christians would build a church on the Adyton floor of the temple, thus officially shutting down the oracle. This basilica was ultimately dismantled by German archaeologists at the beginning of the 20th century. It should be stated that Christians have always been fond of drawing parallels between pagan religions and Christianity. This is an important reason a basilica was constructed on a site heavily associated to the god Apollo. The pagan god of prophecy paralleled Christ as a source of prophecy. This appropriation of this oracular site indicates that Christians, like the Romans, Greeks, and Carians before them, believed that this natural spring was a true source of prophecy. Finally, in the 15th century, fire and earthquakes destroyed the temple, leaving all that remains of the Hellenistic Temple of Apollo today: 3 solitary columns amongst a pile of rubble.